Hello and welcome to Voices for the Voiceless. I have the pleasure of being joined by Dave Neale, the world's first director of Animal Sentience and Welfare for Animals Asia. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Molly. Great to be with you.
Am I right in saying the world's first director of...
I'm not entirely sure. I think there may have been another post in what was the Humane Society in the US or Humane Society International, which was directly responsible for animal sentience. But certainly for the Asia region, then we're definitely the first as an organisation which is concentrating most of our work in Asia to be putting so much emphasis on sentience as well as welfare.
It's so exciting. How did this come about? I mean, you've been with Animals Asia, is it 23 years, over 23 years?
Yes, 23 years, Molly, since 2002. And I originally started just sort of working with Animals Asia on just trying to help develop the charity, because we were a very young charity then. We only started in 1998, so we'd only been operating a few years. And being in the UK, I was more involved in, helping set up the charity and get us sort of well known and raising awareness. But my passion was in obviously working on things like campaigns in particular, and that kind of led me then to working more within China and within Vietnam. And kind of my focus was really on not running those campaigns myself, but developing teams in China and Vietnam with local staff to be able to organize those campaigns and to start to sort of, get our messages out there about various issues which we're going to talk about. So that, I guess, just from working in the field for such a long time, I did a lot of investigation work. So I did a lot of alongside Chinese and Vietnamese colleagues, I did a lot of visits to animal markets and animal circuses, and just to sort of document all the things which were happening. And I guess, and then talked about that, and put together campaign materials to try to sort of influence people on that. But I guess over a period of time, you start to sort of see that there's really a different understanding from people which are visiting animal markets or animal circuses to what I have as my understanding of what that animal is going through, and which is why that kind of led me to this sort of the sentience part, I guess. So it really sort of changed me from being, led more on just the welfare and talking about the suffering to saying maybe there's a little bit of a different understanding of how an animal is experiencing this world. And therefore, if we start talking about their sentience, it sort of brings it back a little bit, and I hope that we can start to get people to associate with those animals on a much more sort of individual sort of level.
That's the real key, isn't it? Proving an animal's sentience. I think once that is proven, once there's enough studies, is it then key for legislative action? Is that kind of something that you can use as leverage to prove pain and suffering? This is against the five freedoms, the basic foundations that we have.
Yeah, animal sentience recognition isn't that silver bullet which is going to change everything, because, we look at our practices, farming practices for hens and for pigs, which are all mammals and birds which have been recognized as being sentient, then they're atrocious. So it's, to me, I guess it's really something which it can lead to better legislation, obviously, because the more recognition of sentience we have, then we sort of bring in more species, which then need to be protected within the legislation that we have, rather than just sort of protecting vertebrates. Then we start to look at invertebrates and things like that. And we start to look at other practices like shrimp farming or even insect farming, which is something which is really beginning to take off globally. And so it potentially means that there'll be better welfare conditions which are then brought in, and then obviously it all depends on just how strict they are and how they're enforced or not. But for me, it's really about the public recognition, I guess, of sentience more so than the legal recognition. It'd be nice to sort of, legal recognition generally comes after public recognition anyway, right? The laws don't generally change until the population's ready for them to change, and then the government will move ahead. So I guess it's more about trying to get some more public recognition that these animals are experiencing the things that they do, in the hope that we can sort of shift the dial in terms of people's sort of thinking and sort of behavior much into a different direction, which improves animal welfare.
Do you think, has there been kind of policy changes, China, Vietnam? Is that something that you can see balls rolling? And
gradually, not particularly on animal welfare. Wildlife protection, for sure. Endangered species, very good wildlife protection laws in China. There's very good wildlife protection laws in Vietnam. Wildlife protection for Vietnam. Vietnam is one of those countries where there's a lot of illegal wildlife trade. There's also a lot of trade through Vietnam as well into China and other countries. And although it's huge, the laws are very, very good. It's just getting sort of being able to implement them, and even the government having the resources to implement them as well, because sometimes the situations are so big. But the laws are there, which is great. You're not fighting to get the laws to be implemented. It's really about supporting the government to implement those laws as much as possible, and then looking at sort of driving down demand for whatever it is that's being traded, which is part of the problem. Welfare, it's only just being touched on in China and Vietnam, and mainly for farmed animals. So there are various sort of regulations which are coming in, either sort of general regulations about treating animals better, not causing harm, but often without real specifics on what that actually means. And I think one of the things that needed for Vietnam is there's a lot more detail that's needed with the law. So, there's a couple of laws on a sort of the husbandry law and the veterinary law, which, if you read it, it looks quite good. It's sort of like animals, shouldn't be harmed unnecessarily. But then there's no detail in there. So there's no way that anybody could really enforce that by going on to, say, a pig farm and then saying you're harming these animals unnecessarily, because there's nothing to sort of back that up. So they will come, I think. The provisions of the laws will come, but it at the moment they just don't really have that teeth that, I'd like to think that we have maybe in this country, whereas at least you do have something. And this isn't me saying that, everything is fine here in the UK, because it certainly isn't from a intensive farming point of view, but at least there is a little bit more to the law which you can kind of target and needs to be adhered to by whoever it is with animals, whether you're a farmer or a companion animal.
It's those pesky loopholes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not, if it's not specific enough, like avoidable pain and suffering. That was one I was researching about fish a couple of days ago, and you think, what is avoidable pain and suffering?
Exactly. And that's where, it comes down to our interpretation, right? Because to me, I'm vegan, so, everything's avoidable. If it's going to cause you pain, to me, it's avoidable because you can just leave the fish alone, don't breed the fish, but to somebody else, then it's like, okay, well, if you're going to use them in this industry, then what is classed as avoidable, what is not? And that's, I guess, where it becomes really difficult to kind of, to interpret, and where at the moment with where our society is, then we're still obviously very much supportive of raising animals for consumption, so therefore it has to be very specific in terms of the welfare regulations that are being put in place to look towards things like humane slaughter, or for animals which are being transported, humane transport and breeding and rearing and things.
I guess what you're doing with the teaching curriculum and all the education initiatives that Animals Asia do, changing that public perception, educating people, because they just may not understand animal sentience, having not been made aware of it earlier in their life. I think that will probably help fill in those grey areas, because they know that the animal will be feeling pain at this point, so they can then maybe try and, it's not an ideal situation, but if they are rearing them for meat, then they can try and do it in a humane way. I mean, it's all...
Yeah, no, you're right.
It
is that, and it's kind of, the work that we do within the sort of educational projects sort of goes beyond just the clear sentience, which obviously sentience is, the capacity to have experiences, positive or negative. I mean, that relates very well to welfare, because obviously we can say, well, if these animals have the ability to experience positive and negative, then one, we should stop the negative, but also we should promote the positive, which is, the concepts of welfare, saying to say that, we shouldn't just kind of put animals in a neutral situation. We should allow them to actually experience joy and experience happiness and develop social bonds with each other and have all those positive emotions. But it also allows us then to kind of extend that as well, to talk about those sort of emotional capacities and even the cognitive abilities of animals and those social bonds a little bit more broadly outside of sentience, but things which make an animal, their sort of natural behaviors and the things that they desire. And I think that's kind of what's missing in some of the sort of welfare discussions that we have. It might be that, okay, well, we need to prevent animals from suffering, or we need to provide them with a larger enclosure or something, but does that actually meet all their social, their emotional, and their cognitive abilities? Things like social learning, problem solving, animals which are doing, their ancestors will be doing this in the wild. There's still a drive for animals to be challenged within their own environments, and to a certain extent, things like environmental enrichment kind of help with that, sort of trying to challenge animals a little bit more positively. But ultimately, we need to look at it and get more detail about the abilities of animals, and then continue to sort of create these programs which enrich the animals' lives positively and allow them to carry out all those different capacities. And that's the bigger educational piece, I think, because once you start to sort of piece all that together, if you start if you start on an educational program which is negative, as in, say you want to stop people from eating pigs, if you go in, and often what we do as welfareists and animal advocates, we talk about the suffering. We show pictures of pigs on pig farms, and and we kind of expect people to be as shocked as we are, and then suddenly to maybe do something about it, and it just doesn't happen. For the majority of people, it doesn't happen, and so to me, it's like, it doesn't happen because the people you're talking to don't really have a emotional connection with the pig that you're showing. So therefore, it's kind of like, oh, I feel a little bit sorry for the pig, but actually, go away and then just sort of forget about it. Whereas I kind of think if you show that pig as a real social animal that has these cognitive abilities of learning and memory and the capacity to recall that memory and to use that in different situations and to pass on that to other pigs as well, you start to develop a better understanding of that pig before you then understand what is happening to them on factory farms. So it's sort of the sentience bit and the emotional cognitive side, I think, needs to come first to get that connection.
It's that
And then
juxtaposition, isn't it?
exactly, and then to sort of say, well, now look at what happens to them, and then you kind of make up your own mind. You've got more information now about a pig or a cow or a bear or whatever it is. You've got all this information about how they experience their world, or how they would experience their world given the freedom. Now can you sort of justify really supporting or being involved in the industry which is causing this? And I think that's where we need to kind of take this debate sort of a step back from welfare and then bring it back to welfare, in the hope that we can sort of bring people along on the journey a little bit more than sort of expecting them to sort of arrive at the final destination where many of us have already kind of got to.
Yeah, I think the what's it called, when you just show someone a really traumatic video or image, normally they just shut down. And in all my years of doing this and trying to advocate for animals, I've realized you can't tell people what to think. You can only give them all the information in like a balanced way. So this is them in the wild, this is how intelligent they are, how sociable they are, and then you can juxtaposition to the farm, the intensive farming. But it's all now, I digress, but it's all now the dissociation, because the chicken nugget or the sausage in the supermarket, obviously you're not associating that with either of those situations, the wild or the horrific intensive farming. It's just that convenience. You pick it up off the shelf and eat it for dinner.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just going from A to B, you can come across 10 or 20 different images of, burgers and chicken nuggets, as you say, and all these things which you don't even realize, but you're taking all this in, like you're being marketed at with this completely different message. And so, and yet we're sort of expecting people then to just have one message about an animal and then completely change, all of their behaviors. It's a really difficult thing to do, because obviously the system is built in the opposite way. Like the social acceptance of using animals as food is huge still within all of our societies globally. And that's until you get to the point where that contract with the social contract starts to be broken, then, then we're in a real sort of difficult situation of sort of convincing people otherwise. Because, I mean, I've got two kids which are now in secondary school. They're both vegan, they've grown up vegan. They don't understand why all the other kids around them aren't, but they've grown up with parents that have eaten meat all of their lives, that have, it's generational, and yet they've never had any different messages. So, it's that you have to really go right the way back to say, well, it's not those children who are making that decision, it's their parents and the parents before that and parents before that. So it's such a difficult thing to kind of change, but obviously we're all here either for that cause or for the other causes which have similar roots to them.
Education and awareness is that is the way to do it. We're just going to keep keep plugging on, and I love that approach. You say that you give them a look at them in the wild, in their natural habitat, present them as who they are, as individuals, as a species, as beings, and then you contrast that. I think that's a really effective way. Is that the same for bears and their sentience, kind of educating
Yes.
people about them?
Similar, yeah. We've been trying to now sort of do that and bring that approach into all of the work that we have. So, I mean, obviously through Animals Asia, a lot of our work is with wild animals more so than farmed animals. So a lot of it is with bears. We also do a lot of work now on elephants with a elephant riding or ending elephant riding campaign in Vietnam. And so we do a lot of education around elephants and elephant sentience and welfare, and also dogs and cats as well. So all of those sort of the four sort of main species, the bears, dogs, cats, and the elephants. And so our educational messages and our public awareness messages around that need to bring people back to that sort of sentience piece and then bring them through to welfare. And then we can use that then as sort of a launch pad to start talking about some of the other species as well. So it's a kind of a wider discussion.
I guess with the bears, you're kind of up against speciesism. I mean, less so for cats and dogs. I always find that when people see Yulin, they're shocked and horrified. And I think, that's happening a lot with many, many other species on this planet. You know, that's not, I mean, it's horrific. And we will get into some of the details later. But I think that's the issue for bears that you've got, is that you have to sort of educate people about all the years going back and the traditional Chinese medicine. Do you have a lot of resistance, people with their beliefs and the culture?
I think for bears, it's only really, it's a very small amount of resistance. I think now, because bear bile actually is not widely used in most of Asia, you know, the majority of people are not consuming bear bile. So it's still a very small number of people. Actually, you know, the majority of people we speak to on bears within China and Vietnam are very supportive of not having, you know, the conditions that bears are being kept in, or not using bear bile, and, you know, are quite accepting of all of the alternatives. So I think, although there is still a pushback from the industry which is involved in this, and within China it's still a legal industry, so therefore it's difficult within China to tackle something or talk about something.
It's legal in China,
it's
did you say?
still legal in China to raise bears and to extract the bile. So it makes it very difficult because, you know, as a country to work in, it's difficult to raise awareness about something which is kind of going against government policy. We have to do that in a different way. And that's why we can use this kind of educational messages about bears and try to sort of bring people in with this idea of who bears are as individuals, and then sort of, you know, gradually sort of talk about some of the uses of bears which are causing them welfare problems. And that's not just the bear farms, but we also do quite a bit of work on trying to look at animals in circuses, and bears a significant part of the circus industry within China in particular. So trying to then maybe get people to kind of see bears differently would then change their behaviors towards them in the future. But ultimately, things like bear bile is, although it does have this big history, a long traditional history, and, you know, it's a sort of a cultural thing in many parts of China and Vietnam, the majority of people aren't consuming it. And, you know, a lot of people don't even know about it, to be fair. Once you start raising the subject, you're quite surprised about it. And so I think, you know, we're in a good place societal wise to put these industries, you know, to finish these industries. It's just that they still have this kind of industry connection and the government connection in China that wants to obviously keep them going.
Is China sort of leaning now? Are they hearing your welfare concerns?
I mean, they're definitely hearing the welfare concerns. They're not really led by those welfare concerns, and you know, are led more by the industry and the fact that there is still money in the industry as well. I think one of the biggest things for China is that there are synthetic alternatives. There's products which are being produced which are just as efficient as bear bile. There's lots of medicinal plant alternatives already, but there are also synthesized alternatives which are beginning now to get more traction. Now, at the moment, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think a lot of them are being used in non-medicinal products that bear bile used to be used in. So it all gets put into all kind of like health tonics and things like this, which is not legal within China. It's only legally being able to use as a medicinal product. So these sort of synthetic products are beginning to get some traction because they've got similar properties as bear bile, but they're not involving bears to produce. If that breaks through into the pharmaceutical side in a much bigger way, then I think that will, in a way, be the advance that happens, and we'll start to see bear farms, the numbers of bears on farms starting to reduce just by the fact that there's not so much demand anymore. I kind of think that's, in a sense, technology kind of answers a lot of our questions, right? It has done for years. You look back before we had cars, everybody was with horse and carts. The amount of suffering there must have been in the world for horses, whilst everybody had their own horse and everybody was moving around in horses. And then suddenly we get the combustion engine, we get the car. Now, obviously, that creates all kinds of other environmental problems.
We're terrible.
But ultimately, it solves some of the welfare problems, because now we didn't need so many horses around. We still see areas of the world which are still reliant upon working animals, obviously, but the majority of us aren't. Things like whales used to be killed for oil, which are going into lamps, and then we found replacements for that. Even going back to our initial discussion on factory farming, intensive farming, the idea of cultivated meat, which is cultivating, producing this meat in a sort of by fermenting it and producing something which is exactly the same, potentially, has this possibility of really changing the landscape for animals if we can get that into a point, or not we, but the people which are producing it can get it into a point where, one, it's affordable, but also, it's something which is acceptable within the public consciousness. And so technology, and it's similar again with bears, almost, may well be the thing which ends up being the driver which changes these industries for good. That means, in between, we don't know that's going to happen, but in between, you've obviously got to keep pushing from just that public awareness point of view, and just keep using the education and information to try to change individual behaviours whilst we're waiting for that technology to sort of catch up and take hold.
That's crazy. What are the posed health benefits to bear bile then?
I think there are some. I mean, it is a product which has been proven to be useful for various ailments. I don't know the ins and outs of it. I think just things like sort of cancers and fevers and different things, it can have an impact. But it's really one particular component. So it's the ursodeoxycholic acid, UDCA, which can be synthesized. That's as far as I'm aware, that's the compound which has the medicinal benefits if it's consumed. And so therefore, by taking this from a synthesized product or extracted from a herbal medicinal product, then it can still have the same influence, it can have the same health benefits. The problem then becomes this whole sort of tradition and culture of using this one product, of sort of shifting people away to start using different products is always really difficult.
I love your approach, though. I was reading that you actually help the farmers that have been using bears for their bile, and you help them to find other ways of income, other ways of supporting their families. And that's such a proactive, and I mean, it will really then have positive steps.
I think you have to, with anything like this, then one, I guess, to be even working in these countries as a sort of an international NGO, you have to very much kind of tread very carefully, and you need to make sure that you are working alongside people and the government and what the government's priorities are. And so, I think we've always taken this, and this has come from when Jill started Animals Asia back in 1998, in that although we want to see practices end, we're not going to sort of vilify the people which are involved in them. When there's a demand for that product, it's really a case of sort of saying, well, how do we somehow meet in the middle? How do we get to a point where we can say, okay, well, we wouldn't have these opportunities of taking bears if we'd have completely lost the confidence of the farmers, the industry, and the government in the first place. So we need to sort of maintain that sort of balance and maintain being in the room, really, by not being overly critical of the practices, but offering a solution for the government to be able to take the bears, but also for farmers to be able to place those bears into something different.
So is that your way? Is that a kind of a key step for the eventual rescue of the bears?
Yeah, I mean, for Vietnam in particular, the government have made bear farming illegal. So It's just that the government doesn't really have the resources to actually do anything with those bears that were in the country. You know, they sort of make a practice illegal, and you know, you've got hundreds of bears, and the government can't just suddenly sweep up all these bears and put them somewhere. So we were there really to say, okay, well, now you've made it illegal, we will operate a sanctuary. We will work with you to rescue these bears, to take the bears from farms, bring them to our sanctuary and rehabilitate them. And so you really need to be able to offer that solution to the government, not just sort of say this practice has to end and you need to deal with it. It's really a case of saying, you know, because they just don't have the resources, and, you know, they were never going to commit the resources to this issue because it's just not that high up on the political agenda of issues that, you know, the government are going to put major sort of budget towards. But once there is a process or a system in place like rescue and rehabilitation, then the government are very open to being able to say, okay, well, now we can go round the farms and we can start to remove bears and we can place them with you. And it's a win-win for them as well, which is great, because then it means that the government are keen to continue and to get this whole industry finished within Vietnam, which we're really hoping now to get all bear farming ended in Vietnam by the end of 2026. That's the agreement we've got with the government, which will then have an impact, I think, regionally as well. So, whereas within China, it's still legal. You know, the Chinese government and people within China and the industry must be watching what's happening in their neighboring countries with this. You know, hopefully, once then there is no more bear farming and no more bear farms at all in Vietnam, then, you know, we really do hope that it will sort of start to sort of send a wave through to China, and, you know, maybe we'll start to see some change.
Absolutely. It's a domino effect, isn't it? It's a domino effect. Once one country says, actually, this isn't right, these animals are sentient, then, as you say, public perception, everything then will start to change. And the way that you're doing it, it's amelioration of the situation for the farmers. You know, they are losing one livelihood, but you are then working with them to make it more. It's not just you're taking the bear away and then that's it. You're actually giving them. What kind of solutions do you have for them?
For the bear farmers actually in Vietnam, most of them are actually quite wealthy. So there isn't really a huge amount of need to provide an additional income. They're actually that is kind of the sort of a misconception in a way, in that, you know, bear farmers are, you know, are relying upon this. A lot of bear farmers just have one or two bears. They're actually quite wealthy. I haven't done the sort of the visits to the bear farms myself in Vietnam, but from colleagues that I work with, they say often go into these places, quite big houses, nice cars, you know, and then
I was not expecting you to say that.
So yeah, it is quite different. So they don't particularly need that. That major sort of any kind of support network beyond that. It's really just a case of saying, okay, well, you know, the government are now saying that you can no longer have these bears, and the bear farmers in theory shouldn't have been raising money off bile extraction for many years because it's been illegal. They probably will have been doing, because otherwise they wouldn't have kept the bears there. But ultimately, you know, these bears then have really just become sort of a part of the family household, more so than part, you know, an actual sort of major economic sort of income for the farmers. So it is quite different.
Yeah.
We work on another project with elephants, which is different, and those people are relying upon the income from the elephants, and that one is we bring in the families to the whole program and we ensure that they, you know, their financial security of those families in the future. But with bears, it's just not really needed. The farmers aren't poor people, unfortunately.
They're doing well for themselves.
Yeah,
do they look
absolutely.
after the bears then? Because I've seen them in these tiny cages. I mean, for anyone that doesn't know what bear bile farming is, it's, as far as I know, not a very high welfare operation.
No, it's pretty awful, and that's where that sort of lack of understanding, I guess, from the sort of the farmer and the bear really comes in, and that's where that kind of sentience and welfare piece is really needed, because, you know, I think a lot of the time we hear from farmers in that, you know, they do seem to have some connection to those bears. You know, they've been there for many years. It's not that they just have a complete disregard for them. They do seem to have some connection to them, emotional connection to them, and yet don't really see what's happening right in front of them. So, you know, bears which are being kept in, you know, very small cages, often, you know, just slightly bigger than themselves, and obviously having that bile extraction, no enrichment, no sort of socialization of bears, and all kinds of welfare problems that kind of brings, both physically but also mentally, living in that kind of situation. And so bears can, when we see them, be outwardly showing signs of stress and trauma as well as physical injuries or infections or whatever. And yet those sort of things seem to have gone missed by, the people which have been looking after them for many years. And they still seem to show some sort of connection with them. So I guess that is why we really do need to kind of take it back to sentience and welfare and start to sort of say, that individual. I think a lot of this comes from the idea that if you can keep something alive, it's okay. And I think this sort of idea of like, okay, well, as long as things aren't dying, they must be okay. And obviously, that's we know that is far from the truth. Health just being one part of welfare. And it's like, well, I've had this bear for 20 years, and of course I've looked after it because I've had it for 20 years. So why? How can you say I haven't looked after it because he's still here, right? And yet, it's then missing that fact that for 20 years that bear has suffered, unimaginable psychological suffering and no doubt quite an extensive sort of physical suffering in that process. That bit is sort of being missed. And I don't think it's just being ignored. I actually sometimes think it's just actually not part of somebody's consciousness that is that individual bear has the capacity to have those experiences.
And it's just a real gap.
Yeah, a real gap, which is, again, comes right the way back to that education piece with sort of, trying to get the next generation, the younger kids, really interested in sentience and welfare about bears, about elephants, and then move that on to, all the other different species. So people really do start to question when they see animals in situations which are very unnatural, just what that animal is experiencing, and can kind of sort of pull back and say, oh, well, I learned all about the sentience of hens. I learned all about their need for social bonds and their need for scratching the ground and dust bathing and being with other hens. And yet I'm seeing this hen in this situation, which is completely unnatural, and then starting to question it. Unless you have that knowledge about the way the animal kind of operates, then you don't question it.
Did just want to touch on as well, talking about sentience and complexities of species misunderstood. The ocean parks in China, or dolphinariums as we may know them better. What is the situation at the moment with ocean parks in China?
There's very little positive situation, I'm afraid, because
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
They've developed rapidly, as you can imagine, over the last 20 years now, probably since the very first ones, and now there are over 100 in all the major cities in China have their own ocean parks. Some of them 2 or 3 within the big cities. And most of those then have captive cetaceans, particularly, so either dolphins, beluga whales, and also now orcas as well in some of those facilities, as well as sea lions, polar bears, seals, and then, a whole array of fish and reptiles, amphibians, blah, blah, blah. A large number of animals in these places. But majority are wild caught, those animals, so have been traditionally been wild caught. It's beginning to change now that the industry is becoming a little bit more established. There's lots more captive breeding, which is being successful than it was, which means that there's a little bit less demand from wild caught. For those sort of 10 years ago, probably, or, we saw imports, lots and lots of imports. So a lot of these animals were coming from either the dolphin hunts in Taiji, associated with the Japanese dolphin roundup. So the dolphins are being hunted, and then they're capturing the younger individuals and then training them and selling them to ocean parks. The beluga whales and orcas all come from Russia. So they're all wild caught Russian individuals. That has actually stopped. So at the moment, there's no capture and export of beluga whales and orcas out of Russia, which is something.
That's something.
The dolphins are still coming, but in smaller numbers than they used to, because there's the ocean parks have a large number of them now, and so now it's really just a case of when those numbers reduce through death, mortality of the dolphins, but also they're being a little bit more successful with captive breeding. I'm beginning to see in the last year or so, we're beginning to hear. So we don't sort of. It's a difficult issue for us to work on because it's a legal industry in China.
Sure.
So therefore, it's not something that Animals Asia is actively, publicly exposing or working on. What we do is we work with local activists to support their work and to try to resource them to make sure that they've got all the necessary resources that they need to be able to continue to monitor the industry and then to put information out there. So in China, the social media is through WeChat and Weibo mainly. And so there are sites which have been set up by something called the China Cetacean Alliance, which is an alliance of different organizations which are basically supporting this one group of people in China that are opposing these. And so we get a lot of sort of feedback on the local news, which is coming out of the ocean parks. And more recently, you can see that a lot of them are beginning to get into some financial problems. I think a lot of them have heavily invested money, expecting to get it back, and gradually it's not coming back quite as quickly as it has done. Now, this is only a small sort of chink, it's not sort of this major thing that are all just going to start to collapse and there's going to be no more. But I kind of guess it might slow the advancement of the industry a little bit. We start to sort of see. I mean, I've been to many of these, and they're all the same. Like they're the exact same model in one city to another. So it's not even like, once they've attracted a whole bunch of people, then really, I don't really know what the attraction is anymore. Like, I don't think they're the sort of places, some people will be going to them a number of times, I guess, but ultimately they're not really changing as a business very quickly to be able to keep attracting people. So I'm guessing that might be part of the problem in terms of the fall starts to go. Some of them have kind of had to move through. So when they started, they were really just dolphins, and then they moved to beluga whales, and then they've moved to killer whales, the orcas. And I guess that then creates a real spike because, once you've got something like orcas, so Shanghai Ocean Park had orcas on display. They were the first place in China to display them. And of course, that created a huge, public interest and people going to see these orcas. But then, ultimately, they're still doing the same thing as they were, 3-4 years ago, and that's not really going to change. You can only do a certain amount of things, and we've seen this globally, right? That gradually the industries start to get, pushed back, and we start to see a change. And what I hope with China is that if we keep sort of documenting what's happening, keep putting it out there, then the rate of change will be a lot faster than it was, say, in the US or in a lot of European countries that, are still sort of hanging on to that old sort of dolphinarium industries, because that's taken decades and decades to get there. I kind of hope that we can get there quicker with China, but it's difficult to say.
I think as well, publicizing the warning signs, because I think for orcas especially, they have really significant stereotypical behaviors, don't they? That you can tell that they're obviously they're not happy, they're not in the ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some, and that's, I guess, the real, the work of this local group is to be able to push that information out. So they actually get, interestingly now, they're getting more and more people which are sending in video footage. So they're not really even having to go out and get it themselves. When we started this campaign, we had sort of 1 or 2 people, and we were having to send them to ocean parks, and they were having to video stuff. And you'd only really get something that if it happened on the day they were there, then you could sort of publicize it. Now it's really a case of sort of sitting and just watching the footage come in. So they've managed to sort of create enough awareness that people are going to these places, videoing things, because everybody's videoing everything, right? So everything's on their phones, and then questioning it because, they're seeing something like either maybe 2 orcas which are looking like they're having some kind of, disputes within the water, or an orca which is refusing to do a certain behavior for a certain reason, and sending that footage into these people which can then analyze it and then publicize it and really show the truth about what's happening. Even, situations where orcas have been seen with wounds, where they've sort of hit the side of the tanks or the metal bars, which sort of the gates and things, where they've actually got blood on them, documenting that kind of thing is really kind of powerful, obviously, because then people start to say, well, why would those animals do that? The ocean park are telling us these animals are very happy, they're all being looked after really, really well. And then suddenly we're seeing the opposite here. So, yeah, it takes time. It takes time. It's taken decades and decades to kind of attack these industries and change these industries, around the world. And it's still in its infancy within China, and that awareness of of the welfare problems is still really lacking. And so that's something that we need to build upon to be able to get there. And then it comes back to that sentience point as well, because if people don't realize that, orcas have this incredible family life,
they're crazy,
and this incredible cultural kind of way of existence. And, they're just sort of told that, they're happy in this situation where often the males will be on their own, and females maybe with another female if they do actually get on socially. Once people start to learn about that complexity of their lives in the wild, then people just generally start to question whether any place, captive place, could replicate that in any way, which they obviously can't.
The ocean, can we replicate the ocean? It's like when I see birds captive, and I just think, I don't think you're going to create a better enclosure than the sky, to be honest. I think that will be a bit of a challenge. Hopefully, when they are shut down, we don't have a situation like we do currently in France. I did look it up very recently. They are still there, the mother and the son.
I think that's the problem with where we're up to now, in that, we've sort of, again, we've sort of broken that social contract in many countries, and France included, which is great. But then it really does leave that remnants of those animals to what happens to them. And without sanctuary, that's kind of the really difficult thing. And, I don't work on cetacean sanctuaries, and I know there are certain organizations that are setting up cetacean sanctuaries, but, it must be such a difficult thing to be able to find those environments which you
Oh,
can
yeah.
take individual animals, bring them to, and provide really good care for them when, a lot of these animals may not adapt easily to going back into the wild. So you have to obviously take a huge amount of responsibility to be able to get them to that point. But
That's
that
it.
is a real challenge, and it will be a challenge going forward in China as well. I would really love to see these ocean parks investing in sea sanctuaries. I kind of sort of think, like, particularly those which are actually located near the sea. Some of them are located almost on the sea. I think,
The
wouldn't it be
irony.
great if that industry kind of changed and said, okay, we're now going to invest in actually sea sanctuaries and developing these sea sanctuaries? But, that's a sort of a pipe dream,
Yeah.
I guess.
Because but it's all comes back to animals and entertainment. People want to see an animal and be entertained, but they don't necessarily want the animal to be unhappy while they're being entertained.
Yeah.
So this is the whole marketing ploy that these ocean parks and these elephant riding places and these circuses do, is that they say this animal is perfectly happy at jumping through a hoop. So
Mm.
people want to be entertained and see them, and it's just so sad that actually the awareness just isn't there, that they're actually incredibly unhappy and potentially trafficked.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's the difficult part, I guess, sort of getting that information out there as widely as we need to be able to see that public change of opinion, which when it does happen, then I think, the industry itself will have to shift quite dramatically.
I love the work that you're doing with elephant riding, because I know not that long ago, it wasn't seen as a particularly, it's like cub petting, I think before the Tiger Netflix documentary, The Tiger King, before that, people didn't really understand the ramifications of cub petting, how far that goes back to wildlife trafficking, then contributing to the traditional Chinese medicine and the tiger bones. And, so I think raising awareness and the first ethical elephant program, that is so exciting.
Yeah, and it is. It's something which we're obviously really proud of in Vietnam, being able to kind of set that up. And again, that's really come about because of the way that we worked in Vietnam with the bears. Then, we had the faith of the government, the national government in particular, to be somebody that was willing to say, we're here to support a transition to something new, but not just to kind of, push you to transition, but actually to put our own resources behind helping that transition happening. And
You're a
so,
team.
yeah, exactly. So once it came to the elephant situation, and the elephants were kind of raised to us, internally, probably back in 2012, 2013, was my first experience of going to the area. It's a Central Highlands province, with one particular province within Vietnam, where most of the wild elephants are still, the small number of wild elephants still live in the national park. And that's where most of the elephant riding tourism happens as well. And so I visited that back in 2013 with some Vietnamese colleagues, and really then sort of thought, the industry is quite small. There was only around about 40 elephants which were being used for elephant riding. It's not, it's not the Thailand and the Myanmar where we're talking thousands of elephants in an industry. It's relatively small. And the government seemed to be willing to discuss different options as well. So as soon as we started sort of going down that line of saying, we're interested in working with you, not just to end elephant riding, but to actually set up a completely different model, which will still bring tourists in. Money will still go to elephant owners. Money will still go to local people, but it has to be done in a different way that we're trying to sort of support. And because the local government, knew us, Animals Asia, from our work with bears, and that we'd been in the country for such a long period of time and continue to be there, then I guess they had the faith in us to say, okay, well, they're not just sort of going to be here, sort of set something up and then leave and kind of leave us to sort of pick up the pieces. And that was really how that started. And the very first tourism camp I such which changed was actually the government's national park. So the Yopdon National Park had 3 elephants, and that was sort of the central sort of focal area for this elephant riding with the camps around the national park. And they had their own 3 elephants, and so we were using the national park as a base when we were in that region. We were getting to know the national park, and we were non-critical of the current elephant riding. And by doing that, then actually one of the individuals in the national park approached us and said, we would like to be that first organization to transition if you're willing to support us to do it.
That's so cool.
So yeah, it was great. So sort of from 2013 up to 2018 was the actual first agreement, and that was with those first 3 elephants. Those 3 elephants are now still part of that program. And we've managed to bring in more community elephants. A lot of these elephants are sort of owned by local members of the community, and they sort of rent them out to the tourism operators. And gradually we've been able to say, okay, well, we want to bring your elephant into this program. We will bring you in as well, employ you as the owner of that elephant. You can care for that elephant, and these people then go out and they spend all their time, all their day with the elephant in the forest, just making sure that their elephant is okay, allowing it to roam freely. And then the national park then bring tourists in to be able to just watch and to learn about elephants, which, learn about the history of these individual elephants, but also see some of those natural behaviors as well, because those elephants just start reverting very quickly to being like wild elephants, and they start doing all the things that wild elephants would normally do. And people wouldn't get the opportunity to see, because the wild elephants obviously are, deep in the national park, and people don't get the opportunity to actually see them for themselves. Whereas they now get a chance to observe a captive elephant in a situation which is pretty much looks wild, and be able to take photos and videos of that, and and get that experience. And it's worked really well. It was really unfortunate COVID came just after we started the program. So 2018 it was late 2018 by the time the program started, in October 2018. So we just had 2019 as it was building, and then bang, it sort of just the bottom fell out of it. And it sort of took a couple of years. I was a little bit worried then that, it'd be easy for the government to sort of say, look, we need to just make money, we're just going to revert. But they didn't. They said,
goodness.
no, you guys, we're with you on this. We're going to keep going. And since then, it's just grown and grown, and we've been able to bring in more elephants. And now we're looking at setting up a second project in a second area. So in this region, there's sort of 2 main regions. They're about 80 kilometers apart. And the other region is where most of the other elephants are still being used for elephant riding. And so now we're trying to replicate it with the community in that region. And well, we've already set up the program. We're now just sort of gradually bringing the elephant owners on board, with the hope that we can end all elephant riding in Vietnam, at least, within the next few years.
It's collaborative. It's sustainable, it's inclusive, everyone's happy, and the animal is happy. That's what we want. We want the animal to be happy as well, and to be exhibiting natural behaviours like they would in the wild. Talk me through the ethics of elephant riding tourism and how you're kind of not replicating that.
Yeah, every camp that uses elephants for elephant riding will be vastly different. And so it's sort of difficult sometimes to sort of say the general problems, because, the way that the elephants are managed, whether they're managed on long chains, short chains, whether they're being used all day or whether they're only used for certain periods of time. Some camps will have better welfare conditions where they maybe allow elephants to free roam a little bit, or they allow them to socialize with other elephants, whereas others will just keep elephants isolated. So they're all very different, but ultimately, I think just the fact that you're stationing an animal for long periods of time, waiting for somebody to come and ride them, means that when the elephants are being worked, they're spending a considerable amount of time in a situation which is very unnatural, very unenriched situation. They're controlled a lot, obviously, because they're a particularly dangerous animal to be around, particularly the males. So, males are used for elephant riding just as much as females. And males are very dangerous, particularly,
Of
when they're
course.
entering must or going into must. Now, when they go into must, I guess most of these camps wouldn't continue using them for riding. They're just too dangerous. But there is a period leading up to that where if you don't know the signs, you might not know that those hormones are changing. And I think a lot of the accidents that happen in camps, particularly involving males or, where males have attacked another male elephant or something like that's happened, probably comes about because just not knowing, not seeing the signs that an elephant was going into this major hormonal change, which is going to make it much more aggressive. So there are all those kind of things which are happening. In some camps, then, diet's obviously not always as good as it should be. That's not always the case. Other camps are providing much better diets. And some camps will be using very negative sort of methods to control and manage their elephants, and others may be using much more positive methods. So they do range quite a lot. But I think fundamentally, you have to kind of look at it and say, to put somebody on the back of an elephant is going to massively compromise what that elephant can do for that period of time that it's there. And then to keep those people safe you're going to have to put some kind of dominance control over that elephant to make sure that it doesn't just suddenly whip round and and knock everybody off and potentially harm or kill people, which we do see happen every now and then. And so the premise that elephant riding is something which can be done with good welfare is something which I just don't really agree with. I think it can be done better in different places, but ultimately, why would we try and sustain it? Why would we say, oh, we must continue to improve the welfare of these elephants in these situations when it's not a necessary thing that we need to do? I get the calls for livelihoods, people, are working in this industry, people that have worked in this industry for years. We definitely need to take that into consideration. And that's where our model has worked very, very well. And I think any other sort of organizations looking at this, I think rather than sometimes maybe looking at the scale of it in a country like Thailand or Myanmar, maybe starting in a small area where there are a small number of elephants and saying, well, what can we do for those 20 elephants? Can we transition those, and work on that and then build upon it? But you have to do it with the government backing and the community backing. Otherwise, you really are just in a fight, which the only winner is then whether the government legislate for or against. And for countries like Thailand at the moment, elephants are like a symbol of Thailand. That's like their national sort of tourism symbol. And getting them to say people can't come to ride elephants at the moment is a long way off, unfortunately. What we need is lots and lots more examples of ethical tourism opportunities so the government can continue to celebrate the fact they have, these amazing creatures in their country, but people don't come to ride them, but come to learn about them in the ways that is happening with our program in Yokdong.
Starting off small, working cohesively, that's going to be revolutionary. I honestly believe that Yokdong National Park is just the start for you guys now, and you found a solution to a problem. Instead of just saying this animal is suffering, you've actually found a sustainable solution. So it's really exciting, and I feel for elephants. They are such intelligent, beautiful creatures, and people being able to experience them when they're not suffering is beautiful. Nothing short of beautiful.
Yeah, no, it is. It is great, and it's great to see people's reaction to the elephants when they see them in the wild. But I think for us, it's also fabulous to see the elephant owners and their mahouts' reactions and how they change, because they do have this relationship. It's been this sort of bizarre relationship where they've had to sort of be the dominant one for safety reasons, mainly on elephant camps. But suddenly they're sort of in this situation where their elephant can show its own personality a lot more, and it has the freedom to do that. And actually, all of our mahouts really, really enjoy seeing their elephant being an elephant and have real pride in the fact that their elephant's now got the opportunity to do something much more natural. So I think that's another thing with this sort of, sometimes when we sort of campaign against these industries, we can sort of vilify people a little bit too much, and we sort of go, and the mahout becomes this sort of bad person that, because they're the ones that are often holding the bull hawk, or the ones which are chaining elephants and etc. But actually, in many cases, these people are actually, they're just like you and I. They're doing a job that they've been trained to do, and they have to do it in a certain way. But actually, give them the opportunity to do it differently, then they welcome it with open arms and really embrace it. And they're the best advocates, really. They're the ones that particularly for local Vietnamese people to come and to speak to them rather than speaking to sort of Westerners that have, been involved in this, to come and speak to a local mahout who has transitioned from looking after an elephant in an elephant riding camp for 20 years and is now living this, their best life with their elephant in, essentially in a semi-wild situation, is really the greatest sort of awareness raising and behavior changing sort of mechanism and tool that we have.
Really restores your faith in humanity, doesn't it?
Yeah,
To know
absolutely.
that people can make this change and that they do care when they see the good results. Dave, there are so many things I haven't asked you. I said that we wouldn't get through the list. Oh, no.
I know.
Well, Dave from Animals Asia, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Molly. It's been a pleasure.